Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Dr. Wes Robertson, scholar of, this is interesting, orthography. He's also author of the book Scripting Japan, which looks at conventions of Japanese writing systems and how they function to create meaning. No idea yet what the book has to do with the study of birds, but I assume we'll get into that later. Right, Wes?
Oh, I got it. I got the joke. Yeah, we will. Absolutely. We'll talk about birds and script.
On this week's show, we all know how deep the Japanese language rabbit hole is, and we've heard it time and again. To attain native-level Japanese reading and writing skills, you need to be comfortable with hiragana, katakana, and condescension to foreigners. But what do things like pronoun choices or writing system choices really say about your identity? Wes will help us figure out why I never got a call back after that audition where I spent the whole time referring to myself as Kono Ore-sama. Plus, Ollie's got your weekly River Cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, I'm sorry to say that there's no River Cruise recommendation this week, as I actually signed an NDA when boarding, meaning I'm not allowed to talk about it. So anyone that wants to find out about this cruise will need to wait till the NDA expires in December 2023, or go for a drink with me and say, oh, go on, just tell me, I won't tell anyone. And that's also fine.
And with Omicron making its first domestic appearance, Japanese river cruises nationwide are once again hanging up the no foreigners sign. Ollie and I will have a soul-searching session in which we start to come to terms with the fact that maybe what we've actually been in love with all of these years has just been our idea of Japanese river cruises. An idea which doesn't reflect the reality of Japanese river cruises and how Japanese river cruises clearly do not love us back. So get your tissues and your one-way return tickets ready for that later in the show. Right now, it's Soap Talk. Brian couldn't be here this week because he saw both sides of the Japan entry ban argument, and as such, both sides have canceled him.
Although he did see it from the inside side, which means he's stuck here for the time being.
Twitter has exploded about the travel ban again. Wes, have you been following
Well, it seems like we recorded last week's episode just days too early, because last week's episode we were kind of like slightly more balanced, and hey, in the end, Japan started to make the policies towards non-Japanese nationals and Japanese nationals equal, and, blah, blah, blah. And now it's like one reported case of a variant which isn't even necessarily proven to be more deadly. And Japan's like, haha, we knew it. We were right all along. No one in, no one out. With the exception of mixed scholars, apparently. Apparently, mixed scholars are the only exception.
No, not anymore.
They retracted that.
Oh, yeah. Really? So that was good for about a day, was it?
Yeah, so it's going to get to a point where when people tell you they're scholars of the Sakoku Jidai, you're going to have to ask them which one.
That's good.
There's two camps about it on Twitter. I've seen people getting very, very vocal on one side saying, good, shut it down, keep the bad foreigners out. And these are like the very much My Japan types where, like you said, Brian on the inside, they're already here. And they're like, I've got mine, and shut the door behind me. And then there's also the Japan is ruined for everyone forever camp.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best takes was in response to your wildly popular tweet about Yuwa Nani Shini Nippon. Someone replied.
Thank you.
Semi-rural Japan Jerry said, if they don't start letting tourists... so Yuwa Nani Shini Nippon is a show which looks at like foreigners at the airport and is normally a bit rude about them. He tweeted saying, if they don't start letting tourists in next year, this show is going to start hunting each of us down one by one, and it's not going to be pretty.
We talked in the extras about word choices and linguistic choices when making jokes across languages, but one of the responses to that joke, which just perplexed me, my joke was that they have to change the title from "What did you come to Japan to do?" to "What were you trying to come to Japan to do?" And my Japanese grammar was "You wa nani shini Nippon e ikou to omoteta noni," or something like that. And someone responded and was like, I don't think the grammar there works. Like, why would you say noni at the end even though you've said nani shini? And I wanted to respond and be like, because there's misdirection with the joke. Because what you're doing is you're changing the sentence, you're switching gears midway to accentuate the joke. But I didn't think it was worth the explanation.
Well, it's not. And it's funny because that joke, if you did in English, would be a lot simpler, right? Because something that doesn't work in Japanese comedy as well, I'm not saying it never happens, but I think it's rarer, is just emphasis in a sentence. So that would work in English by going, there was a show which was called Why Did You Come to Japan? And now it's called Why Did You Come to Japan?
Or
and
how
that,
did you
that
get
kind
to
of like
Japan? Or,
yeah. But that kind of emphasis in tone doesn't always work as well in Japanese, does it? I think your version of the joke worked well.
Well, speaking of things on Twitter and word choices, I wanted to ask Wes about the Ryukogo Taishi this year. They do this every year. They're announcing the winner later today, but this is the popular words of the year. And we follow you on Twitter. We see all your rundowns of the slang of the month. Great source for learning new and interesting super niche vocab. Did you get a chance to look at the Ryukogo Taishi this year?
I did. Some of them I've actually covered. Some of them were new. Some I think are a bit kind of a cop-out. Like, I don't think that Squid Game should be on that list.
Yeah.
And it's just the TV show. I don't know if that's really... I mean, it is a phrase people are using, but it doesn't mean anything besides Squid Game. So,
and also,
like, is it just a popular product list now, or...
Well, there's a lot of Olympic ones. I think there's maybe a third of them. There's 30 nominated and one will be chosen. And there's maybe I'd say a third of them are about the Olympics. And I feel like the Olympics, as they played out, they were definitely in the cultural consciousness, but not the words that they chose. The words that
some of them
chose,
are, though. Because there was that one during the skateboarding event. There was that one commenter who had those really peculiar turns of phrase.
Gonzeme.
And those ones are in the list, and those are very interesting. I don't know if they will. The thing with all these ryukogo or slang or whatever is that the longevity is always in question.
Yeah.
But you never know. Some of them do end up staying around. So those ones are quite interesting. But the ones that are just like a specific event that was popular, I hope those don't win. Those aren't that interesting.
Gonzeme was the only one that I actually thought belonged there. The rest of the Olympic ones, I just kind of felt like Japan was trying to make the Olympics a thing after the fact. It's like, stop trying to make them a thing.
Oh, the word of the year? Oh, you mean unmitigated success? Anyway, if you have an idea for an alternative word of the year, then you could mail us at japanbyrivercruise.com. This show enjoys, relies, and indeed reluctantly accepts your correspondence. So go to japanbyrivercruise.com and click on the fax button and get in touch with us. And likewise, lots of people support us by going to buymeacoffee.com/Japan by River Cruise. There's two ways to support the show. The first way is by buying stickers and other merchandise. So if you want the indignity of having to explain why you have a No River Cruise, No Life sticker on your laptop, then this is one of the easiest ways to do that. Or the way that we prefer is people pledge $5 a month in order to support the production of this show and become one of the boys. And that is a pun. And we're going to be talking about puns in the news. So, what an excellent segue. Well done, me. Let's jump into the news. In fact, we're not going to talk about puns. We talked about puns.
We're not. You almost had it. Just do it anyway.
All right, I'll do the whole thing.
No. Leave it, man. It's fine.
Hey, if you paid us some money, maybe one day we can afford a producer such that I don't make these terrible basic mistakes. In the news, we're talking about pronouns, which is very progressive of us. So, Bobby, without any further ado, shall we jump into
This is a lot of ado.
the news? Bobby Judo, what's in the news this week?
We are doing an evergreen one because we have the perfect person to ask one of the big questions as a foreigner here in Japan. And that question is, Dr. Wes, why do we speak in Katakana? Why do foreigners speak in Katakana?
Well, hopefully we don't, but we are often represented as speaking in Katakana, and that's something that you will see in a lot of comics. My first encounter of it was I'm not sure if you two were in Japan when they had the Mr. James mascot for McDonald's.
Yes. Mr. James was how I launched my YouTube career. That was the first video I ever made, was a parody of the Mr. James video. Because I found it just so offensive. Mr. James, can you tell our listeners who Mr. James was?
Mr. James was I assume some kind of actor who they dressed up in the least flattering clothing possible. They gave him, I believe it was a comb over, poorly fitting slacks, tucked in shirt, and I think they framed him as someone who had some kind of Japanese connection, but he came to Japan to eat the McDonald's American Series hamburgers. And everything he was shown speaking on billboards and everything was written in katakana. And there was also an example that is even more offensive where they had Toshiba had a bread maker and they made an advertisement for it. And they had an actress put on a blonde wig and a fake nose and like white face paint and speak in really stilted Japanese. And it was all subtitled in katakana. And there's plenty of comics, again, that do this. And it's something that I noticed, and it kind of started my career in a weird way because I asked Japanese people like what was going on, and I really didn't accept, as arrogant as it sounds, their explanations. Because I was wondering like there's no difference between in hiragana and katakana, right, in terms of pronunciation.
Right.
So how can that convey like accent? And that was actually kind of a bad question because if you really think about it, in English language comics, font and color and stuff are used to convey sound all the time. But it was a good question that it got me to start kind of looking into it. And what I've seen is time and time again, it's not that accent is being directly conveyed via katakana, but that there's this kind of ideological stereotype of the normative non-native speaker. And there are certain behavioral traits that are attached to these, and what those are depend on the individual. But that is really what is being marked into it. And accent, of course, is then kind of assumed. There's a lot of comics where you'll find cases where a non-native speaker will be shown speaking their own language or speaking Japanese fluently, but there'll still be katakana put in there, or even cases where like even just their pronoun watashi or whatever pronoun they use is in katakana, nothing else is. So you'll have paragraph after paragraph of completely normal looking Japanese, and then all of a sudden they'll say watashi, and then bam, it stands out. Kind of linking to this essential character in the same way that pronouns are used to, of course, in Japanese media.
Right, we've already covered a lot, and I think we should just take stock of the fact that some people, when they learn Japanese, aren't necessarily aware that there are these multifaceted uses of hiragana, katakana, and kanji. Like we all learn in our first Japanese class, there are 3 writing systems, or 4 writing systems if you include romaji, and hiragana is for this kind of word, katakana is for loan word, kanji is for words which have a kanji. If the kanji is too complicated, sometimes they use hiragana. But there's kind of rules that we learn, and then we very soon learn when we're in Japan those rules are sometimes broken. And it might be because an example that you gave in your lecture was the word kohi, right? There is actually a kanji for kohi. That's used in a traditional kisaten, but it might not be used in a Starbucks because that demarcates a different product. And we start to learn things like that. And one thing that I was absolutely not aware of is that sometimes a different writing system can be used to mock. Because about 2 weeks after moving to Fukuoka, I was stopped by a TV crew on the street to ask me something. And obviously, I didn't have good Japanese. I was flummoxed. I wasn't used to being in front of the camera, blah, blah, blah. And I misconjugated kawaii in the past tense. I said kawaii deshita. And that's obviously really jarring to a native speaker. And when I watched it back on telly, really proud and excited, they'd subtitled me in normal Japanese. So, using the proper kanji and hiragana and katakana where appropriate. But that part where I made a really blatant mistake with my grammar, they put it all in katakana. So that was that was an introduction to me of the use of katakana to mock, which I think is what they were doing there. So Wes, can you talk through some of the examples where a deliberate choice to put a word which is normally in kanji or normally in hiragana into katakana may have some nuance beyond just demarcating that's a foreigner?
Yeah, I mean, so the foreigner one's like obviously the biggest one that we see, but there are other cases. I've seen cases where characters that act a bit, especially adults that act a bit foolish or a bit in kind of a Yankee sort of way, delinquent, will have like their pronouns or various things that they say in katakana. There are cases where I've seen it being used to show people that are really, really stressed out, or cases where people or things are acting in a way that is like robotic or inhuman. And there's other cases where, for instance, hiragana will be used to show that a character is kind of silly or cute, or even just kind of, again, all this differentiates characters from whatever the norm is. So separating individuals from, in context, what the normative speaker is designed to be by whoever's creating the media, something that any of the scripts can be kind of employed to do.
So what are the reasons that a Japanese person in writing would choose to vary their script in an unconventional or in a conscious way?
There are 5 main reasons. The first is just that chance. We talk about rules of script use, but in reality, they're mainly just guidelines. And people know different kanji, so that can just happen. Emphasis is one that is quite well known. And then there are a lot of psycholinguistic research that has shown that people have sort of effective links to the scripts. Like if you put hiragana, katakana, and kanji together and say, hey, which one is cute? They'll say hiragana. So the idea that it can be kind of cute. The famous manga magazine Ribbon, for instance, has its title in hiragana, which has often been analyzed as kind of putting off a cute image, as it has comics that are aimed at younger readers. And then there's just the fact that script play is fun. It's a way to make jokes. It's a way to make puns. But there's also the question of who uses script or who is shown to be speaking in certain scripts, these sort of social considerations. So in comics, you have different types of characters that are shown regularly speaking in different ways, different balances of script, and people continue these traditions, they resist these traditions, they modify them to convey information about characters in the same way that in English we might use color or a different kind of spelling. And then also there are just the fact that the way that you write, the way that other people around you write, is something you pay attention to in Japan. So if you see people that you don't like using script in a certain way, you might want to avoid that. I remember personally, I think this is something that a lot of people encounter when they start learning Japanese, is that they take the idea that, okay, kanji are something that you use when you know them. And so you learn kanji and you start adding them and you start adding them, you start adding them. And then I showed a sentence to a Japanese native speaker and they're like, man, why are you using so many kanji?
Yeah.
This comes off as really, really like unfriendly and harsh and difficult. I'm like, I'm just using what I learned, right?
But it's not only unfriendly and harsh or aggressive. It can also be showy. It can also be show-offy. I remember a dude forever ago who, even in his like Facebook messages, he used to sign off with like "Yoroshiku onegai shimasu" in kanji, or he would hand write out like when he signed a birthday card or something, he would write "Yoroshiku onegai shimasu" in kanji. And as a foreigner writing a card to another foreigner, the only reason to write "Yoroshiku onegai shimasu" at all, let alone in kanji, is to show off.
Yeah. I was told once that I came across as rude when I wrote something shite kudasai, but I wrote the kanji. You know the kanji which means, what does it mean, down? I guess. Rather than kudasai in hiragana. And I thought, like, surely it's politer that I'm using the kanji. But no, apparently that means I was giving an order. It was more like I said something shirasai rather than kudasai. So what that means is if I said that out loud, there's no nuance at all. There's no difference. I'm not thinking the down kanji. But in writing, I've got to make a conscious choice. How do I want to be perceived?
I actually analyzed the comic about talking dogs, as weird as that sounds, where one of the characters is purebred and shown to be incredibly pretentious. They have a French name, and they speak in Keigo, which none of the other talking dogs do. But also they have kanji that appear nowhere else in the comic in their speech, and one of them was actually kudasai in the kanji, so using it to kind of mark this character as pretentious. And the basic point here, really simply, is that we know that we pay attention to how other people use language and speech, and then we, judge what they're saying and who they are because of that. The same thing happens with writing, because we pay attention. Okay, what kind of person writes kudasai with kanji?
Yeah. I recently got a mail from somebody, a couple mails, who this person writes kochira koso. The kochira he writes in kanji, and it just like makes me not want to talk to him. It's insane.
This goes beyond just word choice, though, right? Because this isn't like, the choice of saying "rikai shimashita" rather than "wakarimashita," just to show that you're a bit more elevated and elegant.
Or "shochu itashimashita" or "kachikomarimashita."
Yeah, right. So
to show that you're even more elevated.
How dare you?
But then, once you have kachikomarimashita, you can say, is that going to be in hiragana? Is that going to be in kanji? Is that going to be in katakana? It's choices on top of choices, and every choice you make.
Well, we're foreign, so it's going to be in katakana.
Yeah, right, of course.
Yeah. That's what I'd like to discuss, that this isn't really a question of word choice. It's not really a question of grammar. It is just a question of script, right? And even something as simple as like ine. Some people are going to choose ine in katakana or ine in hiragana, and that's going to want to communicate something. And I think what your research seems to do is to say all the reasons that Japanese people think that they're trying to communicate using these alternating scripts might not be what's actually going on. Sometimes their explanation as to why they're writing a certain way only scratches the surface of their actual motivations or what's actually being communicated.
I don't want to say that they're completely wrong, but I think there's often factors that go beyond what they are thinking about. And that's true with any language user, honestly.
Well, it's subjective. It's totally
yeah,
subjective.
Yeah. Like, it's not word choice, but it is language choice. That's really the key point. Script choice is language choice. So maybe they are saying ine in katakana, and that ine is in katakana a lot, for emphasis or to be kind of fun or modern or flashy. And maybe all their friends feel the same way about it. But there's a chance that someone out there is saying, oh, this is the kind of person that writes ine in katakana. Okay. Right. And that is out of their control. Yeah. So you have you ask these young people, hey, why are you writing ine and katakana? And they're like, oh, because it's fun. It's not serious. That's why our friends do it. But then you have someone say, watching and being like, man, I just can't respect those people that write ine and katakana because they're, flippant. Kanji is a big one with you were mentioning it being pretentious. The people that are using it aren't using it to be pretentious. They're using it to be intellectual, right? They're using it, and that's always the flip side. When I do an academic lecture, I'm trying to sound smart, but it's out of my hands if somebody thinks that I sound pretentious and overblown. The language that we use leaves us and then circulates in society, and these views and these discussions of language happen out of our control. And we know this about speech. And we know it about writing when we talk about words and grammar, but it's also true about how we represent words. I often say that if I had written my book in Comic Sans, no one would take it seriously, even though it doesn't have any impact on the actual content of the book itself.
Well, let's ask about that, because in your lecture you talked about Japanese authors kind of varying up, even for the same character, when that character is in different situations, they vary their pronoun usage. I think a lot of times, if you're a foreigner in Japan, you're familiar with people who kind of like pick up their favorite pronoun from their favorite comic or their favorite anime, and then they apply it to themselves. And even when I first came over, I had trouble learning which situations to call myself watashi, which situations to use boku or ore. I just simplified, and I just always go with watashi or jibun in most cases.
Yeah, I find it easy. You just pick one and run with it, and watashi always worked for me.
So, but when a Japanese author is writing this, I wonder how conscious of a decision is it? Or maybe conscious isn't the right word. Is it just natural? Is it something that they're always making a very specific selection, or is it natural just because of their social conditioning?
I think both. The authors that I've interviewed have said that it is something that they think about and consider. Whether or not they consider every single representation and every single change, I would not say that's the case, but there are cases where they do think about it. In the interviews I did, there were definitely cases when they said, oh yeah, I intended that change. In other cases, I saw where I'd say, what about this change? And said, oh, I didn't remember that, but you're right. Yeah, no, that I did actually do that to context when I think back on it.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of both. It's a mixture of both. And sometimes they're just like, oh yeah, foreigners speaking katakana. That's what happens in manga. I'm a mangaka, right? I'm just going to do what I've seen without thinking about it, just continuing. But there is a lot of conscious selection. And the more somebody gets involved in the writing process, so the more they, are a writer, basically, the more these choices become extremely important. Pronoun choice in and of itself is definitely used to differentiate characters. And then when you can also, is this person a katakana ore or a hiragana ore or a kanji ore? These kind of questions allow conveying information in really, really subtle ways. I think the bigger question is how much readers pick up on it. That is something that's a bit unknown. Certainly some do. Like if you say, hey, in comics, non-native speakers, what happens? They'll know katakana. But a lot of people just read, right? Just go through it as fast as they can.
Well, I was actually surprised to see you did a matched guys study where you took the exact same texts and then just varied the script that was used, hiragana, katakana, or more kanji, and showed it to people and asked for their impressions. And it was crazy to me how much they were inferring things like age, class, gender, profession, personality, how annoying the person is, just based on those orthographic choices.
Yeah, and it's terrifying because now I think too much about every single email I wrote. Like, am I using too much hiragana, too much katakana, too much kanji? Am I going to be perceived in some way? But yeah, and it's not consistent. It's not like if you do kanji, this will happen. But based on context, based on what the other person has seen, they will interpret things. For instance, one that surprised me is somebody in one of the ones that I increased the katakana in. A few people said, I've never seen anything like this. This is just meaningless. Like, I don't know why anyone would have written like this. And then some other person said, oh yeah, this kind of meaningless writing, this is what teenagers, like people in their 20s and 30s that don't have a high education do. I've seen it all the time. Mm-hmm. So just like what social circles you've interacted in terms of language use can completely influence that. One person also that stuck out said something about increased kanji being like pretentious women in their 50s and 60s, which was extremely specific. And I wish I could pick their brain on exactly where they kind of encountered this writing group that was so detailed in their mind.
What you're trying to say is that if Karen spoke Japanese, they'd mainly be using kanji.
It might be that way, yeah.
I'd like to know what direction this is heading, because I am not so humble that I won't put my theory to an actual professor about this. That the IME and the way in which phones standardize the way we write and the way that Google autocompletes certain sentences might be creating more homogenous choices.
I don't think it's creating more homogenous choices, but it is creating ideologies that link certain representations of script to people that are bad at technology. So it used to be that, for instance, using difficult kanji was mainly associated with things like intelligence, age, or of course the other side, pretentiousness, being out of touch. But in my data, I have found now that using excess kanji can make people think that you are bad at using a phone. And that, of course, is its own ideological associations that may link to you being older, etc. But I recently did a study on this very interesting form of play where young Japanese women are pretending to be lecherous old men online. And they do this through using certain words, of course. They call themselves ojisan. They use, traditionally masculine associated pronouns, but they also use script. But they emphasize kanji for some words and katakana for other words. And then they also have specific emoji and cow-moji that they use. And the reason is that basically young Japanese women have been playing with katakana, as with ine, etc., that we all know. Old men who want to hook up with them observe this and then try to do it to kind of match the style, but they did it wrong, right? Because there's no guide to it.
Right.
They messed it up. So they used katakana for the wrong words. And then they brought in their own idiosyncrasies, which come from, again, older people tend to use more kanji, also not being good with technology, and adding kanji to the mix.
Also
so
being
when the young
awkward
women
in trying to have a conversation with that big of an age difference.
Yes, the topics are key as well. It's not just a script for sure.
Yeah.
But so when you have these young women imitating old men's imitation of their writing, they have to bring in all these different elements. So like konbanwa can be in kanji, but it can't be in katakana. But ojisan has to be in katakana. It can't be in kanji. And you have to use emoji, but you can only use certain emoji because they're the emoji that old men use that they think young women use. And so you get this complex intersection of ideologies and beliefs and, importantly, observations going into this practice that make it a complete mess to look at. But also, when you unpack it, you can just observe this fascinating web of language interaction in Japan.
This is that exact phenomena where Japanese people observe how they perceive foreigners to communicate and then write us an entire email in katakana.
Yeah. Or if you've ever seen, a Japanese TV show where people suddenly start speaking in cool English, that kind of thing. Yeah.
This makes sense why my Japanese host father, who's an old man, just kept sending me cucumber emojis. he was close enough. Just not... Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 109 of Japan by River Cruise. If you are new to the show, then please subscribe to the show. We have a new episode every week.
Thank you to our guest this week, Dr. Wes Robertson. If you'd like to hear Wes talk more about this, a little bit more in depth, you can find a YouTube video that will link in the show notes of a lecture he did for the University of Cardiff. You can also find his book, Scripting Japan. Wes, thank you for joining us. Anything else you'd like to let the listeners know before we go?
Yeah, if you want to check out any other of my public lectures or the slang reviews that were mentioned, I also have some Japanese educational materials, etc. on my WordPress. And I imagine none of your listeners will be interested in this, but I have a podcast on language and language choice in the extreme metal scene called Lingua Britannica that if anyone wants to check out, that'd be great too.
That sounds more niche than the Japanese river cruise industry. I wonder what it's actually about.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.